Welcome back to Crime Time Inc. My name is Alex, and I'm your host for today's episode, Episode 27 in our Charles Manson series. Patricia Krenwinkel takes the witness stand. Known as Katie to the Manson family, she's about to confess to her role in multiple murders. But here's the thing. Her testimony is supposed to support the defense's copycat theory, the idea that these murders were committed to make it look like Bobby Beausoleil's crimes to get him out of jail. Instead, something far more sinister emerges. As Katie describes life at Spawn Ranch, she paints this almost fairy tale picture. We were just like wood nymphs and wood creatures. We would run through the woods with flowers in our hair, and Charlie would have a small flute. Wood nymphs. Can you imagine? Here's a woman about to describe brutal murders, and she starts with this romanticized vision of Charles Manson as some kind of mystical piper, leading his followers through an enchanted forest. But the fantasy shatters the moment she begins describing the murders themselves. Katie's confession about the murder of Abigail Folger is bone-chilling in its casual brutality. She describes how Folger tried to run, how she chased her with a knife. I stabbed her, and I kept stabbing her. When asked what she felt after stabbing Folger, Katie's response sends ice through the courtroom. Nothing. I mean, what is there to describe? It was just there, and it's like it was right. It was right. Think about that for a moment. Not wrong, not horrible, not even satisfying or exciting, just right, as if murder was as natural as breathing. But Bugliosi isn't done with her. In cross-examination, he presses harder, asking if Abigail Folger screamed when she was being stabbed. Katie admits she did. Then comes the question that haunts the courtroom, and the more she screamed, the more you stabbed. Katie's answer, I guess. Did it bother you when she screamed for her life? No. The defense tries to maintain their copycat theory through these confessions, but it's falling apart under scrutiny. They claim the words written at the crime scenes, political piggy, pig, death to pigs, were meant to link the murders and free Bobby Beausoleil. But when Bugliosi had asked Susan Atkins why she wrote political piggy at the Hinman residence in the first place, she had no answer. If these were copycat murders, why only write pig at the Tate residence instead of the full phrase? And why did Katie write Helter Skelter on the LaBianca refrigerator? Even the defense attorney, Maxwell Keith, isn't buying it. He asks Katie directly, the homicides at the Tate residence and the LaBianca residence had nothing to do with trying to get Bobby Beausoleil out of jail? Did they? Katie's response is telling. Well, it's hard to explain. It was just a thought, and the thought came to be. A thought that came to be. That's how she describes the brutal murders of 7 people. But if Katie's testimony was disturbing, Leslie Van Houten's was something else entirely. Maxwell Keith, her attorney, reluctantly calls her to the stand, knowing what's coming. Before she even begins, he tells the judge that his client is going to implicate herself in the Hinman murder, despite his hours of trying to talk her out of it. Leslie's version of events is transparently false. She claims Charles Manson and Bobby Beausoleil left before Gary Hinman was actually killed, and that Susan Atkins was the real killer. It's a desperate attempt to shift blame, but it only makes her look more guilty. When it comes to the LaBianca murders, Leslie tries to make her actions seem like self-defense. She claims she had no idea what they were going to do that night and only started stabbing Rosemary LaBianca after the woman swung at her with a lamp. But it's during Keith's attempt to show remorse that Leslie reveals her true nature. Keith asks Leslie if she feels sorry for participating in Rosemary LaBianca's death. The courtroom falls silent. You can feel everyone holding their breath, waiting for some sign of humanity, some crack in the facade. Leslie's answer chills everyone to the bone. Sorry is only a 5-letter word. It can't bring back anything. Keith tries again. Do you wish that it hadn't happened? I never wish anything to be done over another way. That is a foolish thought. It never will happen that way. You can't undo something that is done. Do you feel as if you wanted to cry for what happened? And here's where Leslie's response becomes truly haunting. Cry for her death? If I cry for death, it is for death itself. She is not the only person who has died. Think about that. This young woman, barely out of her teens, speaks about murder with the philosophical detachment of someone discussing the weather. No remorse, no regret, just cold, calculated indifference. Throughout most of the trial, Leslie had maintained what observers called her innocent little girl act. But now, under pressure, that mask slips completely. The jury sees her for what she really is. Cold, unfeeling, capable of the most horrific violence without a trace of human emotion. When defense attorney Irving Kanarek questions her, Leslie becomes angry and impatient, snapping back with hostile, sarcastic replies. With each outburst, the jurors physically draw back, looking at her as if seeing her for the first time. Bugliosi notices that even McBride, one of the jurors who seemed sympathetic to the defendants, can no longer meet her eyes. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Despite being the prosecutor, despite seeking the death penalty for Leslie Van Houten, Bugliosi does something remarkable. He realizes the jury might convict her for the Hinman murder, a crime she didn't actually commit, and he doesn't want that. He offers to stipulate that Leslie wasn't at the Hinman residence. Think about that for a moment. The prosecutor actively trying to save the defendant from a conviction he knows would be false, even though it might hurt his case. But when it comes to the LaBianca murders, Bugliosi shows no mercy. Under his cross-examination, Leslie admits that Rosemary LaBianca might still have been alive when she stabbed her. She admits to stabbing her not just in the buttocks, but possibly the neck and a couple on the back. Later evidence would show that many of those back wounds weren't post-mortem. One of them severed Rosemary LaBianca's spine and would have been fatal by itself. Then Bugliosi decides to go fishing. He has no definite proof, but he strongly suspects that Leslie told her first attorney, Marvin Part, the real story of these murders. Part had recorded her story on tape, and though Bugliosi never heard it, he remembered Part almost begging the judge to listen to it. So Bugliosi takes a calculated risk in open court. Isn't it true, Leslie, that before the trial started, you told someone that Charles Manson ordered these murders? The defense objects, claiming attorney-client privilege, but Leslie herself had mentioned Part by name, potentially waiving that privilege. And then something extraordinary happens. Leslie, apparently fed up with attorney Kanarek, snaps, "Mr. Kanarek, will you shut up so I can answer his question?" She then admits that Part had told her what to say on the tape, and she said it. When Bugliosi asks what she told Part, she claims not to remember. But when pressed specifically about whether she told Part that Manson ordered the murders, her answer is explosive. "Sure, I told him that." Did she tell Part that Manson was there the second night that he entered the LaBianca house? After several evasive replies, Leslie angrily responds, "Sure, I told him that." The courtroom erupts. The judge calls for a recess. And as everyone prepares to leave, Leslie Van Houten turns to prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi and delivers one final chilling line. "Mr. Bugliosi, you are an evil man." Think about the irony of that moment. A woman who admitted to brutally stabbing an innocent victim multiple times, who showed no remorse for her actions, who spoke of murder as if it were a philosophical exercise. This woman calls the prosecutor evil for doing his job. But the story doesn't end there. Throughout the trial, all the family witnesses had denied that Manson hated black people, but their explanations were curious. Squeaky Fromm said Manson loved black people because the black man is Charlie's father. Gypsy said the same thing. Leslie had said if Charlie hated black people, he would hate himself. During a recess, this pattern bothered Bugliosi enough that he decided to ask Manson directly, "Charlie, was your father black?" Manson seemed startled by the question. His eventual response was an emphatic denial. Bugliosi believed he was telling the truth, but something about the moment stuck with him. Years later, writing about the case, Bugliosi would admit, "I still wonder, I still do." The confessions of Patricia Krenwinkel and Leslie Van Houten revealed something more terrifying than the murders themselves: the complete absence of human empathy, the casual brutality, the philosophical rationalization of evil. These weren't crimes of passion or desperation. They were acts of calculated violence committed by people who had surrendered their humanity to Charles Manson's twisted vision. The jury that had smiled when they entered the courtroom that February morning had witnessed something that would haunt them forever: the face of true evil, young and articulate and completely without remorse. The defense team was in full desperation mode. Their copycat theory had crumbled. Their clients had confessed to brutal murders on the witness stand, and prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi seemed to have an answer for everything. But Irving Kanarek, Charles Manson's erratic attorney, had one more card to play. Against the advice of his co-counsel, he decided to recall Linda Kasabian to the stand. Remember Linda? She was the prosecution's star witness, the getaway driver who had turned state's evidence and testified against the family. Her testimony had been devastating for the defense: detailed, credible, and unshakable. So naturally, Kanarek thought it would be a good idea to give her another shot at destroying his case. Linda Kasabian had been living quietly on a small farm in New Hampshire with her husband and 2 children. The woman, who had once been a drifter following the hippie trail from commune to commune, had found stability. Her marriage to Bob Kasabian, once on the rocks, was working. She'd rebuilt her life after the nightmare of the Manson family. When she took the stand for the second time, something remarkable happened. She was even more credible than before. Her testimony was so compelling, so unshakable, that Bugliosi didn't even bother to cross-examine her. Think about that. The prosecutor in the biggest murder trial of the decade looked at the defense's star witness and essentially said, "No questions. She's perfect as is." The other defense attorneys, Fitzgerald, Keith, and Shin, had opposed calling Linda back. They knew what would happen. Kanarek should have listened. Next up was Ruth Ann Morehouse, known as Wish, to the family. At 20 years old, she'd once told family associate Danny DiCarlo that she couldn't wait to get her first pig, meaning her first murder victim. Now she was parroting the same party line as the other family witnesses: Charlie was no leader. But then she'd add these bizarre details about how Manson could play with rattlesnakes and change old men into young men. Wish tried to add credibility to the failing copycat theory by claiming that Bobby Beausoleil was the father of Linda Kasabian's second child. It was another transparent lie, but the defense was grasping at straws. When Bugliosi questioned her, he cut straight to the heart of her loyalty. "You would do anything to help Charles Manson and these 3 female defendants, wouldn't you, Wish?" She tried to evade, so he pressed harder. "You would even murder for them, wouldn't you?" Her response: "I could not take a life." But Bugliosi wasn't done with her. "All right, let's talk about that, Wish. Do you know a girl by the name of Barbara Hoyt?" Barbara Hoyt was another former family member who had been prepared to testify for the prosecution. But before she could take the stand, someone had tried to kill her, slipping her a massive dose of LSD disguised as a hamburger in Hawaii. She'd nearly died. When Bugliosi asked about Barbara Hoyt, Wish's attorney advised her to refuse to answer. Under legal procedure, when a witness refuses to be cross-examined, their entire testimony can be stricken from the record. Wish's testimony was thrown out completely. Another defense witness backfired. But the strangest witness of all was 19-year-old Steve Grogan, known as Clem. This was the young man who had participated in the murder and beheading of ranch hand Donald Shorty Shea. On the witness stand, he appeared to be completely unhinged. He spoke about engrams on his brain. When asked about his father, he talked about his mother instead. Most bizarrely, he claimed that the real leader of the Manson family wasn't Charles Manson at all. It was Pooh Bear, Mary Brunner's infant child by Manson. Judge Older was not amused. When Kanarek complained that the judge was smiling at Grogan's replies, Older shot back, "I find nothing whatsoever funny about this witness. I can assure you. Why you would want to call him is beyond my comprehension, but that is up to you. No jury will ever believe this witness, I promise you that. But here's the thing. Grogan's apparent insanity was at least partly an act. Despite his grinning and face-making and incessant beard-playing, some of his responses were very carefully crafted. When Bugliosi asked when he joined the family, Grogan replied, "When I was born of white skin," an almost exact quote from Manson himself. Grogan admitted to being in a car with Linda, Leslie, Susan, Tex, and Patricia one night. He claimed Linda had given them all LSD first and insisted that Manson wasn't with them. But he was very careful not to say this was the night of the LaBianca murders, to avoid implicating himself. When asked about his arrest in the Barker Ranch raid, Grogan claimed he'd been charged with breach of promise. "Some girl you made a promise to, Clem?" Bugliosi asked. "It was a promise to return a truck on a certain date." "Oh, I get it. Sometimes that's called Grand Theft Auto too, isn't it, Clem?" Even playing crazy, Grogan couldn't help but reveal the truth. Then came the most unusual moment in an already bizarre trial. The defense called Vincent Bugliosi himself to the witness stand. As Fitzgerald admitted at the bench, it was highly unusual. On the other hand, in this case, Mr. Bugliosi has been an investigator as well as a prosecutor. The defense was trying to challenge the prosecution's case by questioning Bugliosi about his interview with Susan Atkins and her grand jury testimony. They wanted to know why he believed Susan hadn't told the grand jury the whole truth. Bugliosi was happy to oblige. He enumerated his reasons, noting his belief that Susan Atkins had stabbed Sharon Tate. "How did you come to that conclusion?" defense attorney Day Shin asked. "She admitted it on the witness stand, Mr. Shin, for one thing. Also, she told Ronnie Howard and Virginia Graham that she stabbed Sharon Tate." The defense was trying to reinstate a deal where the DA's office had agreed not to seek the death penalty against Susan Atkins if she testified truthfully. But as Judge Older pointed out, Susan Atkins took the stand in this case under oath and testified that she was lying at the grand jury. If there'd been any agreement, that in itself would have been enough to negate it. By calling Bugliosi as a witness, the defense had only succeeded in letting him reinforce his case from the witness stand. Another strategic blunder. But Irving Knarek was about to make the biggest mistake of all. When questioning Richard Caballero, Susan Atkins' former attorney, Knarek asked about what Susan had told him regarding the words written in blood at the crime scenes. Caballero tried to warn him. "I told you not to ask me that question, Irving." But Knarek, apparently convinced that Caballero was hiding something favorable to his client, repeated the question. Caballero sighed and delivered what would become one of the most damning pieces of testimony in the entire trial. "She told me that Charles Manson had wanted to bring on Helter Skelter, and it wasn't happening fast enough. And the use of the word pig was for the purpose of making them think that Negroes were committing these crimes, because the Panthers and people like that are the ones that use the name pig to mean the establishment. And that was the whole purpose of it, that Helter Skelter wasn't happening fast enough, and Charlie was going to bring on the ruination of the world, and this is why all the murders were committed." He ended with a frustrated, "I asked you not to ask me these questions, Mr. Knarek. Think about what just happened." The defense attorney, through his own questioning, had just gotten Susan Atkins' former lawyer to explain Charles Manson's entire motive for the murders. Not the copycat theory they'd been desperately trying to sell, but the real motive, Helter Skelter, the race war, the apocalyptic vision that drove Manson to order these killings. Knarek had single-handedly destroyed his own case. The prosecution couldn't have asked for a better witness. With their copycat theory in ruins, the defense switched to a new strategy. We'll hear about that after this quick break. They brought in psychiatrists to testify that LSD had so affected the three female defendants' minds that they weren't responsible for their actions. It wasn't a real insanity defense. They hadn't entered that plea at the proper time. But they hoped it might be seen as a mitigating circumstance that could save their clients from the death penalty. Their first expert witness was Dr. Andre Tweed, who claimed to be an expert on LSD. But his testimony was immediately suspect. He based sweeping conclusions on a single, unidentified case where someone allegedly committed murder while under the influence of LSD. On cross-examination, Bugliosi systematically destroyed Tweed's credibility. The doctor had only spoken with Patricia Krenwinkel for 2 hours. He hadn't read the trial transcripts or interviewed any of her friends or relatives. He'd never done controlled research on LSD, had only lectured on it once, and had written no papers on the subject. When Bugliosi asked why he considered himself an expert, Tweed gave a remarkably arrogant reply. What is an expert but what the beholder thinks he is from his experience? Many people consider me an expert, so I have accustomed myself to assuming that I am. But Bugliosi had done his homework. He'd researched the real experts in the field, doctors from UCLA who had actually studied LSD's effects. These experts had written papers concluding that there was no scientific evidence of organic brain damage caused by LSD. Tweed had to admit this was correct. Then came the bombshell. Dr. Tweed had based part of his opinion on a report from Dr. Claude Brown, a psychiatrist who had examined Patricia Krenwinkel in Mobile, Alabama, right after her arrest. Bugliosi had gotten a copy of that report just before his cross-examination. What he found there was devastating. In forming your opinions with respect to Patricia Krenwinkel, did you take into consideration that she told Dr. Brown that on the night of the Tate murders, Charles Manson told her to go along with Tex Watson? After numerous objections and conferences at the bench, Dr. Tweed had to admit he'd considered this statement. Later, Patricia Krenwinkel was recalled to the stand, where she denied the truth of the statement, but admitted she had told Dr. Brown exactly that. Bugliosi now had a perfect score. Each of the 3 female defendants, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten, had previously told others that Charles Manson was behind the murders. Their courtroom confessions might have tried to protect him, but their earlier statements revealed the truth. The Brown report contained other devastating revelations. Krenwinkel had told the doctor that she fled to Mobile because she was afraid of Manson finding her and killing her. She admitted that on the night of the Tate murders, she was coming off an acid trip and wasn't on drugs during the actual killings. Most importantly, she said that after the murders, she was always fearful that they would be arrested for what they had done, but Charlie said nobody could touch us. This statement proved that Patricia Krenwinkel was well aware of the consequences of her actions. She knew what she was doing was wrong. She was just afraid of getting caught. This was crucial because the defense was essentially trying to argue that the defendants were insane during the murders. Under California law, the legal test of insanity is the Naughton rule. A person is legally insane if, as a result of mental disease or defect, they don't realize that what they did was wrong. But it's not enough for someone to personally believe their acts weren't wrong. The test is whether they know that society thinks their actions are wrong. Acts to avoid detection, like cutting phone lines, wiping fingerprints, changing identities, constitute evidence that the defendant knows society views their acts as wrong. When Bugliosi asked Dr. Tweed if Patricia Krenwinkel believed that society thought murder was wrong when she was committing these crimes, the psychiatrist had to admit, "I believe so." Game over. The defense's desperate gambit had failed spectacularly. Their attempt to portray the defendants as drug-addled victims of Charles Manson's influence had only succeeded in proving that they were fully aware of what they were doing and knew it was wrong. Their expert witnesses had been discredited, their star witnesses had damaged their own case, and their own questioning had elicited testimony that proved Charles Manson's guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. Vincent Bugliosi had systematically dismantled every defense strategy, turning their own witnesses against them. The 3 young women who had followed Charles Manson into murder would face the ultimate penalty for their crimes. But the most chilling revelation wasn't about their guilt. It was about their complete lack of remorse, their casual attitude toward the most horrific violence, and their continued loyalty to the man who had led them down this dark path. On March 4th, Manson trimmed his beard to a neat fork and completely shaved his head because he told newsmen, "I am the devil, and the devil always has a bald head." The defense called on psychiatrist Keith Dittman to the stand. Dittman testified that LSD could have a detrimental effect on personality, making users more susceptible to outside influence. It seemed like a solid foundation for their defense strategy. But then Bugliosi went to work on cross-examination, and this is where his brilliant legal mind really showed. He got Dittman to admit that not everyone reacts the same way to LSD. It depends on the person's underlying personality structure. More importantly, Dittman had never actually examined Leslie Van Houten. So how could he say what effect LSD had on her specifically? Then Bugliosi turned the question around in a way that must have made the defense attorney's heart sink. If Dittman couldn't say what effect LSD had on Leslie's mental state, then he also couldn't say whether she had inherent homicidal tendencies, could he? When the defense attorney asked Dittman to explain what inherent homicidal tendencies meant, the psychiatrist's answer was devastating. A person has, let's say, more than the average human being, a killer instinct. Some people, he testified, have a more covert and overt hostility and aggression. In that sense, they are more capable of committing crimes of violence, such as murder. The defense had just handed Bugliosi one of his key arguments on a silver platter. But the real bombshell was yet to come. Next up was Dr. Joel Fort, known as the hippie doctor of the hate. Ironically, Fort looked nothing like a hippie. He was middle-aged, conservative, bald, and spoke quietly. Manson was so angered by Fort's appearance that he shouted, if he ever seen a hippie, it was in the street while he was driving by in his car. Manson's anger had good reason. Even though Fort was called by the defense, his testimony was devastating to their case. Fort stated that a drug by itself does not perform a magical transformation. There had to be other factors at play. On cross-examination, Bugliosi got Fort to deliver what might have been the most important testimony of the entire penalty phase. It was my feeling that Mr. Manson's influence played a very significant role in the commission of the murders. But then Bugliosi asked the question that would shatter the defense's LSD theory completely. Isn't it true, doctor, that people under the influence of LSD do not tend to be violent? That is true, Fort replied. Think about that for a moment. The defense was arguing that these women committed murder because they were on LSD. But the expert they called to support this theory had just testified that LSD users don't tend to be violent. Fort's testimony revealed something else crucial. When defense attorney Irving Kanarek asked whether anyone had ever programmed people to commit crimes, Fort's answer was chilling. Yes. In one sense, that is what we do when we program soldiers in a war. The Army uses a peer group technique and the patriotic ideals that are instilled in citizens of a particular country to bring about this pattern of behavior. The implication was clear. Manson had created his own twisted army. But the most shocking revelation was still to come, and it happened almost by accident. Bugliosi learned that defense attorney Maxwell Keith planned to call Dr. Joel Hochman that afternoon, so Bugliosi cut his lunch short to interview the psychiatrist beforehand. What he discovered was astounding. Keith had never even spoken to his own witness. He was calling Hochman to the stand cold, without knowing what he would say. If Keith had spent just 5 minutes with Hochman, he never would have called him, because Dr. Hochman had examined Leslie Van Houten, and his conclusions were devastating to the defense. Hochman called Leslie a spoiled little princess who was unable to suffer frustration and delay of gratification. From childhood, she'd had extreme problems with impulse control. When she didn't get her way, she would fly into rages, once beating her adopted sister with a shoe. But here's the most chilling part of Hochman's assessment. From a position of overall perspective, it is quite clear that Leslie Van Houten was a psychologically loaded gun, which went off as a consequence of the complex intermeshing of highly unlikely and bizarre circumstances. A loaded gun. That's what this seemingly sweet-faced young woman really was. Hochman revealed something else that shattered the defense narrative. We'll find out Leslie Van Houten's shocking confession about her sexual attraction to Charles Manson after this quick break. Of the 3 female defendants, Leslie was actually the least committed to Charles Manson. She listened to his philosophy, but it wasn't her trip. She couldn't even connect with him sexually, which bothered her. She preferred Bobby Beausoleil because Bobby was beautiful. Charles was not, physically. Charles was short. That is something that always turned me off, said Leslie. Yet despite not being sexually or philosophically drawn to Manson, she still killed at his command. What does that tell us about what was already inside her? When Keith asked Houten whether Manson had influenced Leslie's thought process and conduct, Houtman's answer was brutal in its honesty. She denies it, but I don't buy that. Why didn't he believe her denial? Well, I don't understand why she would stay on the scene that long if there was nothing there for her, on some unconscious basis. As Bugliosi would later argue, many people came to Spahn Ranch, but only a few stayed. Those who did found something in Manson's black-hearted medicine that appealed to them. Houten had asked Leslie how she could profess love for the world while murdering someone. Her answer was chillingly matter-of-fact. Well, that was something inside of me, too. When Keith foolishly asked Houten to interpret that statement, the psychiatrist delivered what might have been the trial's most damning testimony. I think it's rather realistic. I think that in reality, it was something inside of her, despite her chronic denial of the emotional aspects of herself, that a rage was there. Keith kept pushing, and Houten kept delivering devastating answers. In my opinion, it would take a rage, an emotional reaction to kill someone. I think it is unquestionable that that feeling was inside of her. When asked if there was hate in Leslie when she killed Rosemary LaBianca, a woman she'd never met, Houten explained that LaBianca was simply an object, a blank screen upon which Leslie projected her feelings towards her mother, her father, toward the establishment. I think she was a very angry girl for a long time, a very alienated girl for a long time, and the anger and rage was associated with that. This testimony was articulating the heart of Bugliosi's argument that Leslie, Susan, Patricia, and Charles Tex Watson had a hostility and rage within them that existed before they ever met Charles Manson. Think about this. Linda Kasabian was there that night, but when Manson asked her to kill, she said no. Paul Watkins, Brooks Poston, Juan Flynn, TJ, all of them were asked to kill for Manson, and all of them refused. But Watson, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten said yes. So there had to be something different about these 4 people, some inner flaw that existed apart from Charlie. The defense attorneys seemed to understand this, but they were trapped by their own strategy. When attorney Paul Fitzgerald asked Houten about Manson's actual influence over Leslie, Houtman's answer was devastating. Manson's ideas and presence served to reinforce a lot of her feelings and attitudes. It served to reinforce and give her a way of continuing her general social alienation. In other words, Manson didn't create the darkness in Leslie Van Houten. He simply gave her permission to express what was already there. Fitzgerald tried to minimize this, asking if Manson's influence was tenuous at best. Houtman's response was a perfect analogy. Suppose someone comes in and says, "Let's eat the whole apple pie." Obviously, your temptation is stimulated by the suggestion, but your final decision on whether or not to eat the whole pie or just one piece comes out of you. Someone can tell you to shoot someone, but your decision to do that comes from inside you. Irving Kanarek, Manson's attorney, picked up on this theme. And so you are telling us then in layman's language that when someone takes a knife and stabs, the decision to do that is a personal decision. In the ultimate analysis, it is, Houten replied. It is a personal decision of the person who does the stabbing. Yes. In one of the trial's greatest ironies, Kanarek and Bugliosi were now arguing the same point, that even independent of Manson, these defendants had murder within them. Houten found evidence in all 3 women of early alienation, of early antisocial or deviant behavior. Let me break down what he discovered about each of them. Susan Atkins, known as Sadie, actively sought to become everything her father warned her not to be. She told Hochman that even without Charles Manson, she believed she would have ended up in jail for manslaughter or assault with a deadly weapon. Of the three, Hochman felt she had slightly more remorse than the others. She often talked about wishing her life were over. But here's what's truly chilling. Hochman noted the absence of a conventional sense of morality or conscience in this girl. She showed no discomfort or anxiety about her conviction or possible death sentence. Instead, she displayed a remarkable peacefulness and self-acceptance in her present state. Patricia Krenwinkel, Katie, had first had sex at 15, never saw the boy again, and suffered tremendous guilt over the experience. Manson eradicated that guilt and gave her the acceptance she desperately craved. Another psychiatrist had suggested she might be schizophrenic, but Hochman disagreed. Leslie Van Houten had more emotional problems than average, even before joining the family. She was immature, unusually impulsive, someone who tended to act spontaneously without reflection. But perhaps most chilling was Hochman's observation that all three women denied any sense of guilt whatever about anything. They intellectually believed there was no right or wrong, that morality was relative. Yet Hochman knew that you cannot rationally do away with the feelings that exist on the irrational, unconscious level. You cannot tell yourself that killing is okay intellectually when you have grown up all your life feeling that killing is wrong. The guilt was there, buried deep, even if they refused to acknowledge it. And then Bugliosi asked the question that would demolish any remaining sympathy for these defendants. Have you ever read a reported case in the literature of LSD of any individual who committed murder while under the influence of LSD? Hochman's answer was definitive. No, suicide but not murder. As Bugliosi would later ask the jury, could Watson, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten, all four of them, really be the only exceptions in medical literature? But Bugliosi wasn't finished. He had one more devastating blow to deliver, and it required careful choreography. He approached the witness stand privately to ask Hochman a question away from the jury's ears. He wanted to be absolutely certain of the psychiatrist's answer before proceeding. Once he had his confirmation, Bugliosi returned to the counsel table and asked several unrelated questions, so the jury wouldn't know what the private conversation had been about. Then gradually he worked up to what he would later call the big one. The term insanity, Doctor. You are familiar with that term, of course? Yes. Bugliosi continued, basically you define the word insanity to be the layman's synonym for psychotic. I would say that the word insanity is used generally to mean psychotic, replied Hochman. Bugliosi had already established that psychotic meant a loss of contact with reality. He'd gotten Hochman to confirm that none of the three female defendants were currently psychotic, nor had they ever been psychotic. Now came the moment that would end any possibility of an insanity defense. Then, from a psychiatric standpoint, I take it that, in your opinion, none of these three female defendants are presently insane, nor have they ever been insane. Is that correct? That is correct, said Hochman. As Bugliosi would later write, as far as the psychiatric testimony was concerned, with Hochman's reply, the ball game was over. These women weren't insane. They weren't psychotic. They weren't legally excused from their actions by any recognized mental condition. They were simply people who chose murder when given the opportunity. As if the psychiatric testimony wasn't damaging enough, the defense called three more witnesses, hardcore family members whose testimony was as shocking as anything that had come before. 21-year-old Catherine Gillies testified with cold, matter-of-fact brutality. She revealed that on the night of the LaBianca murders, she had asked to go along. I followed Katie to the car, and I asked if I could go with her. Linda, Leslie, and Sadie were all in the car, and they said that they had plenty of people to do what they were going to do, and that I didn't need to go. When asked what she meant by being willing to kill for a brother, Kathy stated, in other words, to get a brother out of jail, I would kill. I would have killed that night, except I did not go. The only thing that prevented her from participating in murder? Just the fact that they didn't need me. When defense attorney Fitzgerald tried to soften this by asking if she had actually killed anyone, Kathy turned to look directly at the jury with a strange little smile and replied, "Not yet." When Bugliosi asked if learning about the murders had disturbed her, Kathy replied, "Actually, it had very little effect on me because I knew why they had done it." She wasn't upset about the murders. In fact, she was upset that she didn't get to participate. Mary Brunner, the very first member of the Manson family, took the stand claiming that police had threatened to charge her with murder if she didn't implicate Manson in the Gary Hinman killing. She now repudiated her previous testimony and denied even being at the Hinman residence. But defense attorney Keith inadvertently made a crucial point. Brunner had testified in both the Bobby Beausoleil trial and before the Hinman grand jury, and neither time had she mentioned Leslie Van Houten being present when Hinman was killed. This actually helped establish that Leslie hadn't been involved in that earlier murder, meaning the LaBianca killing wasn't part of some ongoing pattern for her. Bugliosi had no questions for Brunner. The point had been made without him having to do anything. Finally, Brenda McCann was recalled to testify that on the nights of both the Tate and LaBianca murders, she had seen Manson sleeping with Stephanie Schramm in Devil's Canyon, providing him with an alibi. But Bugliosi had laid the groundwork for this moment 15 months earlier. He impeached McCann with her own grand jury testimony when she had stated that she couldn't remember where she or Manson had been on either night. Her convenient recovery of memory looked exactly like what it was: a fabricated alibi. Brenda McCann was the last witness. She completed her testimony on Tuesday, March 16, 1971. After various delays, including Canarek's bizarre refusal to even stipulate that Gary Hinman was dead, the defense finally rested. As the penalty phase drew to a close, the defense's strategy had completely backfired. Instead of proving that these defendants were helpless victims of LSD and Manson's control, the psychiatric testimony had revealed something far more disturbing: that each of them carried within themselves the capacity for murder long before they ever met Charles Manson. The question that haunted the courtroom and continues to haunt us today is this: what creates a killer? Is it circumstance, influence, drugs, or cult programming? Or is there something darker, something that exists in certain people from the very beginning, waiting for the right moment, the right permission to emerge? Vincent Bugliosi had spent months trying to understand not just what happened on those terrible nights in August 1969, but why it happened. What he discovered was that while Charles Manson may have been the conductor, the orchestra was already tuned for violence. Linda Kasabian said no. Paul Watkins said no. Brooks Poston, Juan Flynn, TJ, they all said no when asked to kill. But Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Leslie Van Houten, and Charles Watson said yes. The difference wasn't in their circumstances. It wasn't in their exposure to LSD or their devotion to Manson. The difference was in who they were at their core, in the loaded guns of their personalities, waiting for someone to pull the trigger. Now we are ready to pull the trigger on the analysis of this episode by our two crime experts, Simon and Tom, after this quick break. Don't miss our exciting next episode when the jury decides on the fate of all four defendants.
Alex, thank you very much. Episode 27, fascinating. Simon, it gets more and more interesting as we go into this sentencing phase, a penalty phase that you and I are just not familiar with at all. The thing that struck me about it was these girls now, Leslie Van Houten and whatnot, they're taking the stand and talking about their crimes. And it's the cold-hearted, matter-of-fact way they're doing it. They're articulate, they're confident, and they're utterly emotionless. And it must have had a huge effect on the jury to hear that from these young women.
It's like a trial within a trial here, Tom. It's very strange, isn't it, where you go over a lot of the evidence again and bring witnesses in. And it seems to me like an awful strange way of doing things that you have. I don't see why the original case isn't enough. The original evidence being led over a period of 10 months isn't enough for the judge to make up his mind about a sentence thereafter.
Yeah, that's the thing about it, Simon. It's not the judge who does make up his
Yeah.
mind about the sentence. In their system, it's the jury.
The
It's the jury who decide. And in this case, of course, the jury have to decide whether it's the death penalty or not.
What I don't understand is if the jury have heard enough evidence to decide on the guilt or otherwise of the accused, why is that not enough to then decide the sentence as well? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, without a rehearsal of all the evidence. Yes, I do know what you mean. But I think if I was a member of the jury and watching these girls come forward and talk so cold-heartedly about these dreadful murders, this is not just an accidental stab wound in a fight or knocking someone down on them, knocking their head. This is multiple stabbings, dozens of stabbings of people, including Sharon Tate, who, you know, she's heavily pregnant. I mean, it's just unthinkable. I think if I was a member of the jury, I'd be thinking, these girls sound intelligent and articulate, but there must be something else going on. I would be beginning to think that they were insane in some way. And of course, we go on later on in episode 27 to talk about the effects of LSD.
We'll come on to that because in this episode 27, it's very much talking about the expert witnesses with regards to their mental state. Mm-hmm. Before we go on to that, Tom, just that you're mentioning there, I asked you before about if Charlie had put a suit on and got himself a proper defence and played the straight bat, then maybe there would probably have been a different result to this. Certainly in this stage, when they're fighting for their lives, they're trying to defer the death penalty. As far as they're concerned at that time, their lives are on the line. But still, they can't play by the rules of the court, maybe shed a tear or two and show some remorse for what they've done. Because I think that a simple show of emotion in front of a jury, we're talking young women here. I think one of them's 20. I think a wee simple show of emotion and a wee plea for clemency would have done the trick. But none of them saw fit to even attempt that.
No, and I absolutely agree with you. And I think if the girls had done that, I wouldn't have been surprised. The thing about it, Simon, is that if Charlie Manson had done that, if he'd played the game and worn a shirt and tie and done all that stuff, he wouldn't have been Charlie Manson. That's right. The whole point. That's the whole point. There's so much about him which is about performance, about being Charlie Manson, about being this messianic figure.
But why do the three girls not take that route then? That's beyond me, Tom.
Because they have been totally brainwashed. Yeah. And I use the word advisedly. That's what's happened to these girls. They have been brainwashed. And this is what's fascinating about this case, is that they were completely brainwashed and remained so.
Yes. And it's interesting that the lawyers decided on this tact, which was probably the first time we really saw a strategy from the respective defences to try and get clemency. They would say, well, wait a minute, these girls were totally brainwashed by Charles, so how could they be responsible? It's his fault. They were just acting out what he has commanded them to do. And that's where the psychiatry came in. And I thought, again, Belosi plays a blinder, doesn't he?
He does. He does very much so. I have to say that I did enjoy in this episode that Krenwinkel self-destructs in the court.
Yeah.
I thought I was looking forward to that because that man has been a nightmare throughout this whole trial. And I'm going to be delighted to find out what happened to Krenwinkel after the case going forward. Yeah. Because he has just been a complete... I mean, if he's not disbarred from the legal profession, I don't know what it would need for somebody to be disbarred, frankly. Awful.
I thought it was brilliant when they were talking. I mean, he just keeps coming up with the answers all the time. The defence are leading. This is their witness, Houten, the expert psychologist. I'll talk to you about expert witnesses in a wee minute too, because that's something we should maybe explain to our Crime Time Inc. listeners who might wonder what is an expert witness. Yeah. But Houten, there's an old rule that I was always taught in court by solicitors. It's why they do precognitions and background checks and all the rest of it. Never ask a question that you don't know the answer to. And the defence fall right into that trap with their own expert witness, because he starts telling the truth. And what comes out is that these girls are not mad. They're just bad.
Yes. And I thought, too, when we come on to LSD, the effects of LSD, I thought that was interesting, too, because it was, oh, well, you know, they're mind-altering substances, etc., etc.
Yeah.
But, of course, coming out, and the thing is that there is absolutely no record of any violence associated with LSD.
But maybe suicide, but not harming other people.
That's right.
Yeah, it's the stupid things you do when you're under the influence, but violence and murder's not one of them.
That's right.
Tom, I wanted to speak to you about the expert. Like me, you'll have dealt with them. In fact, you've probably been an expert. I've been an expert 6, 7 times with regards to surveillance evidence that I've given in the High Court. What about yourself? Have you had much dealings with expert witnesses over the years? Or do you want to explain to our listeners what an expert witness is and what they can bring to a trial?
You've got to be very careful about them. First of all, and this is going to sound obvious, but you've got to make sure they are experts. Because an awful lot of people call themselves experts and then they come up against the cross-examination of someone who exposes them not to be. I think the best example, and you won't be surprised when I cast back to this, but the best example of expert witnesses are people who realise the areas of their expertise and the areas that they're not expert in and stay away from them. And don't try to cover all angles and expose themselves. And some of the great forensic scientists like Glaister from the Ruxton case are a very good example of knowing their limitations.
Yes.
And in that trial, you might remember the famous instance of the cyclopic eye, which was discovered amongst body parts down at Moffat in 1935. And Glaister could not explain that. Yeah. He just couldn't explain it, and he said so. I have a theory, which I can tell you, but I can't explain it. And of course, the defence didn't want to hear the theory because the theory would have implicated Ruxton in it. I'm sorry to blindside any of our listeners who have not read Ruxton, The First Modern Murder. You've really got to get yourself up to speed and read that book to find all the expert witnesses.
And of course, our friends across the Atlantic, Small Town Dicks, Tom, covered it extensively and with your cooperation and brought out a podcast. And we reviewed it here on Crime Time Inc. a few series ago.
That's right, we did, and it's a super product. It's well worth a listen. But coming back to expert witnesses, I think they're very valuable. In my experience, you've got to be absolutely sure about what areas they're going to be speaking in. I had a very good friend who was a forensic odontologist, so it was all about bite marks. Right. And he said he was precognosed for the World's End murder trial. He said it was quite interesting because it was clear during the precognition by the Crown that he was being tested as to what exactly he was going to say and what he wasn't going to say. He said that he had no doubt that if he'd gone off-piste at all, he wouldn't have been an expert witness.
Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's a couple of things there, Tom. One, with the expert witness, it's one of the few exceptions in criminal court where opinion can be used as evidence, because we know that jumps into hearsay evidence and whatnot. And normally an opinion wouldn't be of any use in the court. It would be discarded immediately. Expert witnesses can be given some leeway because of their background. The other thing I wanted to say, well, what makes an expert? Fingerprints is probably the most common example that's used day and daily in courts up and down the country and indeed the world. And I know that in my day, a fingerprint expert was someone who had worked exclusively identifying fingerprints and recording fingerprints for 7 years. Is that what you remember?
Yes, it was 7 years here, but at one time it was 10 years.
Right.
Then I think it was reduced to 7. I don't know what it is today. It'd be interesting. But of course, the big area of expertise now in witnesses is DNA.
Yeah.
When they do a mathematical calculation. And DNA evidence is now seen as so definitive. Expert witnesses who speak to DNA analysis and the probabilities, it's all about the probabilities. It's 1 in 10,000, 1 in a million, 1 in 50 million. They always get very, very, very thoroughly grilled by defence agents because it's such an important area of evidence.
Yeah. The one thing about it is, in my experience in the High Court, and I've had a few experts in cases, the first thing the court does is establish the expertise of the witness. The first thing that whoever's using him, whether it's the Crown or the defence, they read the evidence of his or her credentials, and then the court decide if that's sufficient to continue as an expert witness. The court decides on a witness-by-witness basis if there's expert evidence that's eligible for the court.
And I've also heard in the charge the jury summing up, a judge actually cautioning a jury to be careful about accepting all of a particular expert's witness, because of course the defence produce expert witnesses too.
Yes.
I've heard that when you get two experts in slight conflict, you
Yes.
very seldom get them in total conflict, but you get them in nuanced conflict. I've heard the judge very carefully charge the jury and put it on record now. You've heard this and you've heard that. You may wish to consider this aspect or that aspect, and very carefully try and steer the jury through. Yeah.
The classic with that, Tom, was fire raising, because you've got somebody working for the defence that's been hired by the defence team, an expert. Mm-hmm. And then you've got someone working for the fire service, working for the prosecution, helping the Crown prepare a case. So it's fascinating, the conflicts and looking at things with different specs on, how it can be given a different slant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Tom, throughout this episode, there's so much detail here that Alex dug up. I really recommend that anyone interested in the climax of this case and the repercussions thereafter. Remember, at the time, it was the longest murder trial ever in America. And to this day, it's one of the longest. I think there's only one or two that surpass it. So it's a long, long trial. Lots in here, Tom, that's brought out. And really, our listeners, the detail is fascinating. Alex, again, has done a fantastic job. For instance, the LSD that you were talking about, there's lots more information about that attempt murder in there. There's one of the accused coming off the stand and accusing Bugliosi of being an evil man. You're an evil man. This is someone involved in the horrific murder of 7 people, stabbed someone to death and beyond, calling Bugliosi an evil man. It's fascinating.
I find that interesting because that's a classic case of separation. They actually are separating their own actions from the consequences. And so they feel they can make a judgment, a moral judgment, about someone as being evil or not evil, because they don't actually associate themselves with what's happened. What they've kind of, I don't know, kind of excused themselves of anything. It's just normal. That's the chilling thing about these girls. There's no emotion whatsoever.
And the temptation then is to think that there's an insanity. But that's a dangerous word for you and I, because we know lots of people that have tried to escape circumstances and consequences by running down that road of insanity at the time of the crime or after the crime. But Bugliosi, again, he deals with it brilliantly here, where he actually goes over and speaks to Houten, off camera, if you like, off mic, and knows that he's on safe ground, and then reads him down the road of psychology about psychosis, psychotic behaviour, a loss of contact with reality. And he gets Houten to say, here's the expert that the defence brought in to say that they're not insane. They're just bad people.
Yeah, they're just bad people. That's right. Fascinating, but Alex has done a super job for us again. I always think as these episodes go on, the interest is going to wane and it's going to run out of steam. But actually, I find myself in every episode looking forward to the next one.
Yep. And then we have Brenda McCann, The Last Witness. Episode 27 takes us right to the conclusion of that part of the trial. And we're left hanging, waiting for the verdict with regards to sentence, Tom, in episode 28.
Looking forward to it, Simon. Looking forward to it.